All right. Thank you all for coming out tonight. This is a really great turnout. Welcome to the Architecture Forum. This is our first event of 2024. And if you've not been to an Architecture Forum event, it's an attempt to bridge the gap between art history and architectural history and architects. I'm Kathleen and this is Izzy, my co-organizer, and we're really excited today to welcome Mark Crinson to speak about infrastructural realism. So for like quick housekeeping things, the bathrooms are just right up there in that little kind of like hallway area. I would advise not attempting to cross over into Loria until the event is over because they shut the doors between us, which actually is what this event is meant to bridge, but you know, just yeah, conceptually, we're trying to bring together art history and architectural history, which is something that Mark has written about. So today we're introducing tonight's speaker, Professor Mark Crinson, who comes to us from England as an emeritus professor of architectural history at Birkbeck, University of London. He's previously taught at the University of Manchester, beginning in 1993, and was vice president and president of the European Architectural History Network. His recent books include Shock City, Image and Architecture in Industrial Manchester, which came out in 2022, and just now won the 2024 Historians of British Art Prize. Together with Richard J. Williams, he co-authored The Architecture of Art History, a Historiography in 2019. In 2018, he authored a monograph titled Allison and Peter Smithson, and in 2017, he published Rebuilding Babel, Modern Architecture and Internationalism. He's really been quite busy writing lots of amazing books. And he comes to us today on the occasion of becoming a visiting researcher at the Yale Center for British Art, where he is working on another book, length project on the history of Heathrow Airport and the history of its surrounding landscape. So he'll be speaking today on a strain of this project titled Infrastructural Realism, and we're very pleased to welcome him.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Thanks to the Yale Center for British Art for supporting the research that I'm doing here, and thanks for being here on a cold night. My paper today is a combination of parts of two chapters in a book project. And I need to tell you a bit about the book project to start. The title of this book is Heathrow's Genius Loci. And I hope you get the kind of irony in that title, because nobody would usually think of an area like Heathrow as having anything like a spirit of place about it. And yet, I would say that the very importation of the idea of the genius loci to Britain owes something to the area. It was Pope, actually, who is credited usually with bringing in the idea. And Pope's house, in which he demonstrated what genius loci could be, was just on the edge of Hounslow Heath, which was a kind of famously villainous, even sinister area of heathland, flat, extremely flat heathland, which is where Heathrow is now established and has been established, of course, since 1944. And that heathland in the 18th century was common land, was common waste land. It was not enclosed, it was not ostensibly owned for productive purposes through farming, but it had ancient rights of access to it by commoners, and lost those rights very, very late. Only by about 1820 did it lose those rights. I'll mention it a bit more to come. So there is an irony in the title here, because I am very interested in landscape. You might wonder how I do that with something like Heathrow. Well, partly it's because I do it by not just talking about Heathrow, I talk about the area around it. It's almost become, it's funny, sometimes ethics becomes something you grow into, but it's become a kind of ethical principle in this project that a perimeter is not a boundary for one's research. Perimeter is a good reason for going beyond the perimeter. You know, to understand what a perimeter is, what a wall is, you need to look at it from the other side of the wall, the boundary or the fence. So that's one principle I've got in my work. There's another principle too, another boundary, which is a temporal boundary. Normally, of course, if you say you're writing a book about Heathrow, then people would say, okay, well, that starts in 1944 and it maybe continues to the present. Well, no, my book starts in the 18th century because that's a temporal perimeter I wanted to go beyond in order to basically to try to establish what this place, this landscape was really about before we got there, and to see if there's any kind of resonance with that past in the current state of Heathrow and the area around it. And this is a large area, it's a town, it's as big, you know, 60,000 people working. So we're looking at a town here, and we're looking at what goes on beyond the town as well. Okay, what I want to do is just go through these chapters very, very quickly. The talk today is really a combination of some things in chapters 3 and 4. I'm fascinated by images like the one on the right there, which superimposes the airport onto the farmland that was there before it. That gives you a sense of what some of it. Chapter 1 is on the 18th century, full of, well, with some very interesting geometrical impositions upon the landscape. What you're looking at in the bottom left is General William Roy's 5-mile baseline. That's this very straight line right across the map. That is actually, that's a map that shows something in the landscape in a temporary form. It's not a encoded line. It's not a kind of cardinal point, for instance. It's actually going right across the middle point of the map, an actual line drawn or constructed in this flat landscape. That gives you a sense of Hounslow Heath, also the image bottom right, which is one of the very, very rare images of the Heath. That to me is interesting, that there is so little visually about it. And above it, on the top right, is an estate that actually projected into the Heath, Wootton Park. And one of the things that immediately should stand out from that is the moat around it, and indeed the double line of trees screening the whole estate from this terrible villainous area around it, full of people like to pilfer and poach your deer. That's actually a kind of an ornamental garden within there. Chapter 2 jumps forward to the 20th century and the wartime requisition of the land. That wonderful map on the top shows exactly who owned the land, how much was paid for it by the government, and what that land was for. And below it shows the scheme. This is 1946, and about 2/3 of that, is there a pointer? Yes. Up to about there is what we have. This kind of double triangular set of runways with this diamond in the middle where the terminals were mostly. There are 2 now beyond that. None of this up here was built yet. It's always been controversial. This is known as the 3rd runway, and still is. It's always been on the cards that would be built since 1946. Chapter 3 is on, so moving outside the perimeter, is on what I call arterial, modern, I guess. 30s, this focuses on Penguin, the publisher, who located just north of what would become Heathrow. and were from time to time threatened by Heathrow. You see that plane in the picture. It's one of my aims in the book is to have as many pictures of buildings with planes in the sky above them as I can. The image above it doesn't have a plane because Heathrow wasn't there when that was taken. But this is the transformation. Penguin publishers are famously mass publishers, cheap paperback books. There was, I believe, an architectural and spatial equivalent for that in the very location of Penguin, on a road in which light industry was located. So the architecture goes along with the very aesthetics and ostensibly the politics of the publisher. Diamond Terminals is about that middle part of Heathrow and the terminals that were built there. Some of today's talk come from that. Viewing Platform is about glamour and detention, because obviously an airport has many functions. Glamour isn't really a function, but it's part of the way in which an airport kind of draws you in and makes you feel as if there's something special perhaps going on, despite all the rubbish as well. Detention, of course, is what airports also do. One of the central buildings of that diamond was called the Queen's Building, and it was a great viewing place. Hundreds of thousands of people would come there during the year. It's as popular as the Tower of London or Windsor Castle, until the noise became terrible. And so, and I'm interested in Terminal 3, and you'll see these are two stills from a film, The VIPs. I forget the date, about late 1960s. And they show, one of the incidental things they show, this is the glamour part of the chapter, is a series of paintings, so actually enamel on steel up here, okay, by a man called Stefan Knapp, a Polish, very interesting Polish emigre, who did actually some huge commissions for stores in New Jersey too, and indeed in New York, including the, I forget the name of the buildings, the famous Mies van der Rohe in New York. What's it called again?
Secret building.
Secret building, yes. And thank you. But inside, you see the other side of these murals. They are advertisements. Many people have written a lot about abstract expressionism and popular culture, mass culture. And this is a kind of almost recto verso expression of that. Chapter 6 is about noise, which obviously is about outside the perimeter. This is a school, prize-winning school, designed by Dennis Clark Hall, 400 yards from the northern runway. It lasted 15 years because, as you'll see here, look at that classroom open to the air. How could that possibly survive airplane noise? Well, it couldn't. And this is a noise map, noise contour map. Very interesting kind of way of, a very crude understanding of noise. But there's also a kind of crisis, and I use that term deliberately, around 1960, 61, 62. And the government is forced to bring in a committee on noise because there's not just airplane noise, but also car, motorbike, lorry noise. And I think there's a similar investigations in the States at the same time. Chapter 7 is aeropastoral. This is about 2 business parks north and south of Heathrow, quite near it, which involve terraforming, almost completely transforming this landscape, making it hilly. You're making the level landscape, the flat landscape, hilly, giving it lakes, basically taking out a lot of rubbish, taking out that and putting the gravel pits, because it's a very gravelly landscape, and building hills with it, and then locating business parks in Californian north and south. If any of you watch Premiership football, you'll know there's something called VAR. VAR is looked at by a group of people sitting in a building in Stockley Park. This is Stockley. And the last chapter is about high tech in Heathrow. Largely it's about Terminal 5, which you see here. Bubble, because there's this peculiar internal landscape created by high-tech buildings like this. Fable, because the airport, in its kind of glamorous side of what it does, wants to be seen as a cosmopolitan, of course. All right, let's get on to the paper as such. I'm going to read this. In a scene at the beginning of the British feature film Out of the Clouds of 1955, a man is seen strapped into a plane seat. The title of his book is prominent, The Control of Water. This is Bill, and he's a Jewish American hydrologist heading to Tel Aviv via Heathrow. An image that gives a human face to technical aid then, and here in the form of hydraulic expertise for the 7-year-old state of Israel. The subject is potent, but there is much to this imagined scene, shot in the studio, that we now take for granted. A ramifying set of support structures that enable what is going on. Bill travels in a civil aviation plane adapted from the rapidly developed technologies of wartime bombers. Its hold is filled with passengers' baggage, and the workers who operate the plane are both front and back of house, in the pilot's cabin, and in the service or care work of other flight attendants. The plane travels to and from international airports, whose numbers, locations, and the flight paths between them were all agreed under the terms of the 1944 Chicago Convention on International Civil Aviation. The plane is about to land on the concrete runways of London Heathrow Airport, opened only 8 years before, on land requisitioned by the British government using wartime powers. The airport's immediate landscape is densely and extensively occupied by roads and reservoirs. At Heathrow, Bill will pass through the still incomplete Europa Terminal building and from there travel to Tel Aviv. Much of this dim context is what we've learned to call infrastructure. And it has typical, but it must be said, curious effects here. Reassurance of a clean modernity, that is until it goes wrong. Product of war and promise of the dispersal of its traumas through new good technologies. Enabler of a smooth globalism, replacing inter-nation state conflict through communications and travel. Superordinate reason for government by benevolent diktat. And nature clearly at bay, requisitioned, made geometric, subordinate. The Oxford English Dictionary tells us that the term infrastructure was first used in 1927. Part of the reason why I've called this talk Infrastructural Realism is that I'm concerned with historical specificity. I'm not concerned with realism as a style. I'm concerned with the developing and changing notion of infrastructure. So infrastructure was first used in 1927, and this relative newness explains why there are no established antonyms for it. Even now, I think, you probably struggle to think, what is the opposite of this term, infrastructure? Architecture? Superstructure? It expresses a compound or confusion of physical objects and metaphor. After all, what is infra or below? Because that's what infra means. What is below a structure? And if it is the foundation, then there's simply too much building going on in this term. Is the structure part of this, something real or something metaphorical? The growing usage of the term, as well as the flourishing of images of it in the immediate post-World War II period, was generated by the great rebuilding projects of the time, as well as new typologies like the International Airport itself. In 1951, infrastructure was described as, quote, a new term denoting fixed military facilities such as airfields, base installations, and transport systems. There's also used by Winston Churchill in 1950, when he's attacking the Labour government for using what he calls the jargon of infrastructure. Interestingly, that use is related to the Labour government putting forward a proposal on how to relate Britain to Europe. And there was a clear need for this term. I'm going to give you a trivial but rather telling incident, for example, of that occurred in 1946 that bears on this matter of nomenclature. After the passing of the Civil Aviation Act in that year, lawyers pointed to the ambiguity of phrasing that limited, quote, the installation of other apparatus upon land, which they claimed, the lawyers claimed, could be taken to include farmers using tractors. I mean, this is in relationship to an airport. So this phrasing could be taken to include farmers using tractors on neighbouring land, as much as the intended aim of the Act. Matters like beacons being built, so high objects being built on the immediate, just outside the periphery of the airport. So clearly, terms like installation and apparatus weren't doing the job that they were meant to be doing. And presumably a decade or two later, the use of infrastructure rather than apparatus might have clarified this. In 1946, Le Corbusier chaired a symposium on this subject, infrastructure, convened by the Congrès de l'Aviation Française, precisely to deal with the new opportunities and problems of air travel. So infrastructure is actually, the term is actually quite, its growing usage is quite closely related to aviation. For Le Corbusier, the airplane itself was architecture. You probably know this, yeah. Airplanes are architecture, yeah? So. Whereas infrastructure was, in a sense, everything else, was background. Wide open skies, he said, wide open landscape, and wide open concrete runways. Rayner Banham, just a few years later, the architect of Britain, even suggested that the hangar and the petrol pump were the early airport's only necessary features. But if aviation was exemplary, this wasn't because it was to be embodied by a limited set of objects. Infrastructure obviously is more complex than that. The airport terminal building will show us why, and that's my main kind of topic here. This is the physical and psychological transition zone between the anthropozemic, which means machine-centered, and therefore human-hurting, anthropozemic, and the anthropophilic, the human-centered, human-loving aspects of an airport, or indeed any other kind of structure. I've used a term in the chapter that I can't really go much into, extra structure, as a kind of useful coinage. I use it precisely to identify these kinds of zones in which infrastructure is mediated to allow its coexistence with human activity and presence. Now, contrast this post-war emergence of infrastructure as a term with more recent definitions. Brian Larkin's work, I think, is especially astute, defining infrastructure as, quote, the physical networks through which goods, ideas, waste, power, people, and finance are trafficked. Notably, this includes non-material things like ideas and finance, as much as goods or people. And it's also, as the term trafficking implies, not in the negative sense, marked by a trace of, or perhaps in that sense too, marked by a trace of skepticism towards universally benevolent effects. The last decade has, obviously, as most of you will know, has seen considerable theoretical expansion of the concept, particularly in fields like anthropology, history of technology, urban theory, and the sociology of knowledge, mostly generated in response to more globalized forms of infrastructure, as well as the constructive tissues, the connective tissues of more invisible or even immaterial forms of communication. In relation to the latter, even architectural history and theory has responded. There is the idea of infrastructure as spatial software, as a network, circuitry, nodes, and some uses expand the concept beyond the inevitably diversifying kits and parts into such matters as relations between society and technology and the way these are managed. Infrastructure seemingly is both massive connective mechanism, something that includes almost every aspect of urban life. Thus, quote, infrastructures make empires, unquote. The city is, quote, infrastructural machine, unquote. Even, quote, infrastructure is constitutive of the modern condition. So it's become a hugely inflated concept. This expansion of the concept and its multiplying metaphors owes much to the changing nature of early 21st century technologies. In particular, while the growth of infrastructural talk has not neglected older technologies, for instance, telegraphy has been a telling example of an older technology brought into this kind of discourse. It is undoubtedly the internet that has encouraged a view of infrastructure as hidden substrate, which is problematic. And of course, Trevor Paglin's work has shown this particularly. And it's problematic because this hiddenness depends entirely on from where or what perspective the looking is done. The stuff gets built, gets maintained, produces effects destructive to the environment. Its hiddenness is because it is just not proximate to some people or not noticed by them. Now, what is important from all this for my study, and more widely for any realist approach, are those issues of the emergence of infrastructure as a category, what it takes to be recognized as such, or what it entails in terms of desires, fears, and meanings, as well as what all this implies for other elements of the environment. Okay, let's return to London Heathrow Airport. Now, pre-war airports like Croydon here, which was effectively London's airport before the war, pre-war airports essentially adopted the layout and positioning of the railway terminus, with runways and hangars separated from passenger handling structures, the latter to be placed in what Banham has nicely called a companionable cluster off to the side. And this is how they distanced the anthropozemic, contact with machines, danger of that, from the anthropophilic. Handling a new generation of bigger aircraft and swelling numbers of passengers, and it increased extraordinarily fast, both of those things, Heathrow placed its buildings centrally on the right here, in the midst of runways. So you had to have a road underneath the runways to get there. Clustered around a control tower with the aircraft taxiing in to park around this hub and hangars pushed to the edges of the airfield. Now you can see there are obviously going to be problems. One of the problems is going to be parking, because you let cars into the middle and soon you have the whole of that central diamond taking over the car park. The other is with increased numbers of planes, you're going to have to expand the parts of the terminals that take the planes in, and therefore you're going to need much more space around them. Let's imagine Heathrow in its first years without terminals. You'd enter the hubs that served as primitive passenger receiving shelters on the edge of the newly enclosed expanse. So this is what you had. While waiting, you pay a shilling for a brochure, let's say. Taking it across the hut's carpeted boards, this is the brochure, sorry, those are the carpeted boards, to a chintz-covered armchair. The brochure's cover photograph shows a brace of propellers and the sheathed metal of an airliner posed heroically against billowing clouds. The title in its grandiose font is positioned above this on a striated blue field. The contradictions intimate what follows. The airport's state of transition is up front with the first article in the brochure. Work begins. There is an image of the world's largest concrete mixer working on a runway, and 3 others of concrete being spread and levelled. 2.5 million square yards were covered, you're told, with concrete 8 inches deep, 40 miles of drainage pipe laid, 2 million tons of earth moved. The article reminds you, not a little, of something from Picture Post, perhaps, or the American equivalent, Life. Its style of works documentary has the same leavening about it, a big enterprise made story-like. The second article, Airport of the Future, shows the aerial rationale behind those images of ground-hogging labour. The runways extend in great parallel and diagonal courses across the Middlesex flatlands. Middlesex is the county that Heathrow is located in, or was the name of the county. Well secured by dotted boundaries, well served by the white lines of local roads. Next up, London Airport for the World traces future flights across the world's continents. Its map reminiscent of those tracing imperial trading routes. Seated on your chintz, you do a bit of plane recognition, updating wartime skills. Is it wartime spotters? Look on the top right there. Radio aids for the pilots. So you read about radio aids for the pilots, about airport communication, briefing the airmen and air cargoes. Towards the back of the brochure, you meet the men and girls in uniform who will serve you. You're interrupted. Called to your bus to be conveyed across all that concrete. There's nothing particularly profound or memorable about the brochure. It's a marker, a token of passing a new threshold in your experience. This is the first such brochure produced by Heathrow. Hence, of course, there's certain awkwardness about address and content. What should a brochure about an international airport say? After all, what it guides you to is a huge enterprise with vivid geometric form, but with little coherent human experience, at least in civil aviation associated with it. Threaded through the brochure are 2 barely related themes. We could call them the logistical sublime and the management of behaviour. The first is about activity, scale and numbers. The second about comportment. The first makes us admire the plenitude of the airport, even especially as it is in construction. The second takes us to the men and women who run things, their skill and knowledge, their physical attraction, their reassuringly well-kept uniforms. There are clearly contradictions and uncertainties. The chaos of loading baggage without beltways and the sudden huge rise in passenger numbers, often making the hutments, if not quite a posh detention camp, then certainly nondescript. These are all sidelined by images of anecdote and humour. And if vicarious intimacy with men and women at work on their machines might not reassure us that logistical scale is really under control, then the enormity of the work and the workforce employed in building the runways is avoided by the photographs and dealt with by statistics. And I think this has something to do with an avoidance of any implication of the great Soviet work schemes and of course the Nazi labour projects, which were too recent memories to risk evoking. Of the two themes, the first, the logistical supply, is clearly more problematic in these Heathrow representations, while the second, human presence and its comportment, can be more easily idealised or fantasised. Somewhere between the two, the airport as infrastructure is yet to emerge clearly into representation. The same year as this brochure, having sorted out the shape taken by its runways, the airport authority began to develop its buildings. These were to be positioned centrally, we've seen this before, of course, in a diamond-shaped space of about 150 acres. Frederick Gibbard, who took over as the architect after several years, in fact, of trying to resolve it without using more money, understood his work as, and I think that's interesting in terms of, trying to come to terms with something that we now call infrastructure. An architect wasn't necessarily seen as the person to do that job. So Gibbard understood his work as unprecedented, with a necessarily fluid design brief for which, quote, no one knew the answer. And I think that was true around the world at this time, amongst other international airports being built immediately after the war. Relations between baggage, customs, people, and transport would all have to be thought afresh. Gibbard's designs are attempts to represent infrastructure and its extrastructural relation to other things, not as opposed, but as interwoven. So in Gibbard's conception, the Europa terminal streamlined twin but inverted processes, preparing passengers for flight and processing arriving passengers. Now, a lot of what I'm going to say, of course, are things that we today are very used to when we go through a terminal. You take them for granted, but they weren't at that time. So I think we have to remember that in going through designs like these and these kinds of problems. Parallel movements in opposite directions cross the depth of the big rectangular box. Departing passengers arrive in a machine, bus, or car, enter the larger processing machine of the terminal, then move from airside or landside along 12 parallel channels through a concourse and across the transverse zones of customs, immigration, and health before reaching waiting rooms. Meanwhile, at ground level, their separated baggage moves by conveyor belt along another set of 12 channels. Bags and passengers finally arrive at another waiting machine. In its guiding, separating, and processing of people and things, the terminal makes everything as if infrastructural. But what did this imply about behaviour? How, in other words, did you learn the terminal, learn how to behave in it? This, I think, can be distinguished from the leisurely and orderly expectations in contemporary public buildings, like, in British terms, the Festival Hall on the South Bank. And also from the common experiences of train travel, even in major terminal stations, which might involve similar components, but usually without issues of security and customs and without systematic separation of baggage from people. In the finished Europa building, the dampening of noise was important to the they thought a lot about noise inside these buildings, very little about outside. So the dampening of noise was important to the very particular behaviour expected of the passenger. Quote, the general atmosphere, according to one guidebook, is one of apparent leisureliness and quietude, an effect achieved by the suppression of echo. Apparently, the Ashburton marble used for the floor had no percussive resilience, while ramps were designed to be sound deadening. It's important, especially so in light of the ubiquity of such terminal conditions today, to understand this sonic and haptic environment as an intended part of the process of processing that is going on, and is quite separate from the noise and pollution being created by the airport and its aircraft, from which the terminal interior would increasingly over the decades be sealed. As one guidebook put it, despite the quiet and unhurried feel of the place, the constant human activity of travel-urgent passengers is apparent in the hall. So terminal guidance is very important here to passengers, to users. Terminal guidance models and shapes what might be called a purposeful passivity, temporary relinquishment of agency in return for the managed distractions of a total environment. This is best exemplified in an unusually ambitious guidebook of 1956, published soon after the opening of this first terminal. The guidebook makes temporally encompassing gestures with its choice of artists, and they in turn bracket the experience with incongruous but familiar references. So Gordon Cullen here provided quiet images of the central area and the outside of the new terminal, both with a kind of nautical 1930s jauntiness, as if the runways were a calm sea, and the terminal, the yacht club, topped by the fluttering flags of other class. While Felix Topolsky chose the windy viewing terrace of the Queen's Building beside the terminal, where his inky coils and blots, this is the style that he was really famous for, made people appear like Dickensian characters visiting, say, Ramsgate. But if the newness of the international airport as an experience was avoided, I think, by both artists, this could not be said of the guide's main article. Passengers' Progress, this is used a combination of graphics, drawings, and photos across six double-page spreads, to convey the movement of passengers through the terminal. Progress here implied a rather stately, considered, and orderly movement, even a procession, if you like, across a near ceremonious sequence of spaces. And it is this processional aspect that was conveyed by the graphics. First, the reader passenger was given the whole sequence via cutaway isometric and a photograph of a model of the terminus, with a yellow line marking the route in numbered stages. Then each of the double-page spreads has photographs of different spaces within the terminus, and now a dotted yellow line marks out a route across the photographs and through the following pages, from the weighing of baggage until the final arrival at a plane. The article explained the progress, of course, and in a way that was simplified and undoubtedly attractive. But in doing so, it also tried to avoid the element of agential submission or abandonment that was necessary to the process. But the thick yellow lines were perhaps too insistent. And so in the next article, travellers and their friends, readers were encouraged to relax with images of the snack bar, the restaurant, a children's playroom, shops and hairdressers, as if to reassure them that some normality was still possible. More direct instruction to navigate the unfamiliarity of the Europa terminal experience, the taking away of volition, continued to require instruction and continued actually for a number of years. Here's a guide from the late 1950s. This is what it says. Assembly points, according to routes for intending passengers, are lined along the inner wall of the building. These channels, as they are termed, through which the passengers must pass in order to reach his aircraft, lead straight on to the apron beyond. An illuminated number will show the departing passenger his proper assembly point. You will be told which channel is yours on checking in, and again by loudspeaker when departure is imminent. By each channel, you will find a bay of green leather armchairs and tables where you may wait whilst your plane is prepared for you. Now, obviously, there's something incredibly banal about such passages. Yet they indicate both what was unfamiliar and what was at stake. As guides for passengers, why is there such inconsistency of address? Why is there often a sales pitch underlining the remarkable and the luxurious, as if passengers need luring onwards? And anyway, when would they read such guides? Even the term channel had some novelty and possible ambiguity about it. Such issues are part of a deeper, almost ontological shifts. Passengers are giving up choice in how to move and where to move. They subject themselves en masse to a separation from belongings, to a parallel lining up, to an inspection of credentials as subject citizens. They are being closely observed by the state and the law, capital S, capital L. Yet there are also consumers and doughty travellers. They've paid for the experience, and they've done so because they expect to transcend their normal lives, if not quite in this way. Lionel Brett, who some of you will know, was a critic on the kind of softer side of contemporary debates about planning and architecture, was quite disturbed by Gibbard's approach and picked up on exactly these concerns. This is what he wrote. To us, the passenger is a package on legs, or more accurately, a weak swimmer in a strong current of a circulation diagram, accepted, inhaled, sucked into a backwater, ejected, swept on, tempted by well-cited impulse sales girls, automatically sorted and counted by turnstiles, and finally disgorged into some kind of streamlined transport of which all kinds look increasingly alike. Brett's article appeared in Architectural Review's July 1955 issue, accompanied by this, a drawing by Kenneth Brown, which expresses none of these anxieties. We look from the second floor restaurant balcony down 2 levels through an opening created for escalators onto the ground floor. The glazed wall allows us to see a landside car parking area, but also planes landing and taking off beyond that. Our scopic position is aligned with elegantly posed flight crew further across the bow. And everywhere we see leisurely, well-dressed passengers in ostentatious array across the vast concourse. Dabs of bright lemon yellow pick out these new airport folk, while a paler yellow outside suggests the promise of a summer's day. Indeed, the behaviour depicted could easily be transposed onto a public park, perhaps the garden of the country house. The passenger is hardly here Brett's package on legs, automatically sorted and counted by turnstiles. Despite escalators marking out the channels, the distribution of figures across the space is anything but organised, standardised and processed. And yet, as the section overlaid on one side of the drawing suggests, Brown's image coexists with Brett's analysis, much as holiday-making passengers negotiated everything Brett described. Brown only shows us one side of the building, barely a quarter of its depth, and without any hint of the extraordinary movements of baggage beneath. This is extra-structural space, as I mean the term. It offers a kind of mediation, softening or Britifying the infrastructural processes happening all around. Brett and Brown's responses cannot be resolved or chosen between. The terminal was about both happy cavorting, or at least glamorous disporting, and machinic production line processing. The cavort ornaments the function. It's a balance that is ideally represented here, of course. The reality over the next 70 years was of a periodic unsettling, a tipping, exposing the illusion. Some of the other threats to that balance. What are we doing for time?
We're at 7:24.
Yeah, it says. I think we should stop here actually. This is a whole new section. Shall I do that?
Oh, we could take some questions.
Yeah, I'll do it. I mean, I was going to just previously say what I was going to do.
Good.
Yeah. So I was going to go into this other freedom to talk about some of these things through the medium of a film. And it's a very interesting film, actually, which I interpret as not as the way it's usually interpreted, which is kind of men learning peace after wartime. So that they've been wartime pilots, and they become peacetime civil aviation pilots. But instead, I interpret it as learning infrastructure. These are all stills from the film. There's lots about this kind of stuff in it. There's a kind of interesting kind of craft element. The figure on the right, played by James Robertson Justice, is a pilot who listens to his engines in order to discern what nobody else can discern, that one of them has a problem. And this central agora, the concourse, cosmopolitan kind of space, ideal space, with lots of caricatures, racial caricatures. And there's this very interesting kind of rather dark side to this film, which is about this German Jewish woman who's been in a concentration camp, and the terms transit come up around it. And then with this Jewish American, the hydrologist we saw at the beginning of my talk, they're put into this kind of extraterritorial area, roped off, literally roped off. And this is kind of this traumatized that she remembers. This kind of just this genteel rope is the trigger for her remembering her experiences. And then a really kind of weird part of the film, she is kind of locked up in a kind of detention center. And finally, she's freed. And of course, infrastructural things happen. All right, that's it.
Wonderful. Would you mind taking a couple of questions, comments, whatnot? Yeah, good.
Sorry, it's rather long, isn't it? Time describing my chapters.
I'm very quick. Okay, not quick. I have a two-parter question that I'd like to pose. First of all, thank you for such a lovely presentation. I've been thinking a lot about the particular term phrases that you use with logistical sublime, and much earlier on when you were kind of reflecting a little bit about the properties of infrastructures. And it includes, I would say, this very brief almost aside that was talking about the process of being noticed, where it pertains to this kind of physical mechanism. And I guess there were just kind of two words in my mind that maybe I would like to invite your response to. So kind of examining the central position of Heathrow Airport, even to now, I think I'm very much struck by, to a certain extent, its monumentality, because an airport project is huge. It goes beyond the scales of most direct architectural work. And yet it kind of exists beyond that aesthetic function within an urban landscape. As you were pointing out earlier, it kind of occupies the stratus, this peri-urban space. And I was also really drawn to that this idea of circulation, and of course the relationship between airports and other kinds of infrastructural development, where and how it links to the kind of transitions in the production and circulation of capital, where it is both simultaneously going through this industrial mechanism where it subjects the people who are, luggage with legs or whatever, alongside this kind of dematerialization of actual productions. And so I was wondering if you have anything that you might want to, share about this kind of intertwined notions of the monumentality and also circulation.
Yeah, clearly circulation is for. And in this case, in the case of international, it's part of a kind of work of other international airports around the world, across which you circulate people and goods, and with them, of course, money. I mean, it is a major. It's like building a new town. I think that's probably the nearest equivalent. It's like building a whole new town. And of course, that means that you can make huge mistakes in the early planning, which take a lot of time to or can't. You especially can make big mistakes with scale. If you haven't got enough land, or indeed if you've got too much land too. And you can make a big mistake, as Heathrow did, with trying to locate all the terminals in the middle. And that meant that when there were big planning inquiries when they came to Terminal 4 and 5 outside the terminal, because they both involved acquiring land. One of them involved acquiring a huge sewage works as well. That Terminal 5 inquiry was the longest in planning history anywhere in the world, 12 years. Not sure if I've answered your question, but it throws up lots of issues that one can talk about.
Thanks for such a wonderful presentation and a peek under the hood of the project that is that you're cooking up. I also wanted to pick up on the question of circulation and maybe return to one of your central arguments, which is to reframe the notion of infrastructure by pulling it away from, I think, the habit of seeing it as that which withdraws from perception or that which is hidden. I took that as one of the central arguments theoretically that you're making. I mean, I think that's very powerful. And I also think in recent work on infrastructure, there's been an effort to think through not necessarily what infrastructure is or where it may lie, but what it's doing. Sort of what is the activity of infrastructure? What kinds of actions is it producing, and what kinds of actions is it soliciting from subjects? So in that sense, I wonder if the wonderful documents which you showed around the circulation systems of Heathrow and trying to teach a new public how to circulate in this new fashion. might be one way of thinking what infrastructure is doing at this moment in time. And in fact, it's not simply circulation as a thing, but it's a process by which we're actually beginning to think about infrastructure, being taught to move through infrastructure, being taught to kind of naturalize it in some respects as well.
And well put, yeah, the public using an airport need to learn quite a lot, not just about where things are, but how we should behave.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Because we're kind of letting our own, agential responsibility, as it were, kind of putting that in the hands of, the environment we're in.
Yeah.
And this environment is a kind of meeting point of these, of things we're familiar with and that are human-centered, and things which are machine-centered. And through learning that, and through architects learning how to do that, and through airport managers and developers learning how to position these things, we're coming up with an ability to identify what is this mediating zone, which I think the terminal rightly should be seen as being.
Yeah.
Not architecture and not infrastructure, but a mediating zone, between those things. I think you.
The air traffic control here.
So the students experience.
Yeah, I can follow up on that. I think because this talk cuts off at 1956, and I'm sure your book carries on the last 50 years of Heathrow much better. But I'm curious, in that 1956 architecture review article, there was that juxtaposition with the assembly line versus the scaffolding park. And I guess the question then is how did that manifest? Or did the public learn how to navigate the situation, or at least and how has that affected and how that has changed over the years since?
Well, clearly the public did eventually learn, but it's interesting how long it took to learn. We don't today into what we don't see them in guidebooks, brochures. Yeah? We don't see messages like the ones that I read out. There is an interesting exception it's got, you may know Max Hirsch's book, which is called Airport Urbanism. It's about East Asia. In these, where there's a lot of migrant workers traveling by plane, some distances as well. Now, these workers have, as it were, a whole different system from international travelers. And so check-ins for them, processing is actually quite new. And they have, it seems from Max Hirsch's book, there's a revival of this kind of, literature telling them what to do. Because it's different from the established means of processing. But it's interesting how long at Heathrow it took to, for the airport to feel that people had learned, they learned how to behave. And of course, many people were entirely new to their travel in 1956. We've suddenly got mass transit going on, sudden explosion of numbers, and that continues to explode and breaking the seams of airports. That were built in the post-war period, that constantly broken, new terminals having to be built, bigger terminals, more terminals, So those increasing passenger numbers are huge and continue to be a huge kind of influence upon airport form.
We actually have pizza, but we can absolutely continue the conversation. I'm just gonna interrupt to bring that in. So.
No, I was wondering about the, relating to this conversation about the circulation and the kind of internal organization. You showed a lot of these cut sections and so forth that show the kind of internal organization that is, the terminal, which is of course very central. But it seemed like there was some sort of confusion about the architectural language itself. I mean, starting with the very strange crystalline, almost like a, tower in the middle of the runways. And then you even cited this idea of, that the terminal looks like a ship, But it seemed like, I wonder what role and what was the conversation about the architecture of the airport and what role does it play in this, educational
Yeah,
infrastructural agenda? Because it seemed like it didn't quite gel.
I mean, Gibbons' Europa terminal kind of has, it has lots of marble, it has broad steps, it has a lot of kind of those kind of luxurious appurtenances on one end of it, anyway, on the kind of entrance end of it. And as I said, in that film, I didn't look at it's largely centered on that part of it, the concourse, the agora. So that's familiar architecture doing its familiar job. Yeah. And so it's as you go beyond that, as the passenger goes beyond that, that you kind of lose that, or you begin to lose that. And you sometimes it's drawn back. Obviously, lounge is a way of drawing you back, giving you the chance to look out. But actually, as increasingly you penetrate the building, you're losing architecture in that sense, just as we're losing rain volition. Yeah.
And that you must have thought about that aspect and how much it influenced rising generation of architects who were not even remotely interested in the buildings per se, but in the process. I'm thinking of Zachary Price or even Jim Sterling in a way, and his obsession with circulation as a generative aspect, and the kind of way projections become gradually and then increasingly the preferred way of revealing that dimension.
Yes, but that cutaway projection that we saw was actually not drawn for architects or buildings, right? It was drawn as a means of explaining the building to the not to passengers as well, but to the airport managers.
But you would also get those kinds of drawings when you boarded a ship.
Yes, that's actually yes, I agree. And they have yes, no, definitely that's quite an interesting comparison, isn't it? So you get those cutaways in which you can see the actual engine room as well as the cabins, as well as the swimming pools. Yeah, no interest.
And again,
Yeah.
that is what interested some of the next generation.
And you see
Not
some
the
of the,
building.
I think the museum produces some of those cutaways lines, doesn't it?
Of the South
Yeah.
Asian army.
That's well in that.
So we'll continue over.